3 of the TRF book club. I'd like to introduce our new co-CEO, Bruce Dixon. Bruce, if you would like to, oh, sorry.
Liz, there's a 20-second lag, so it is there.
Okay. Bruce, if you'd like to take it away.
Sure. Amazing day, everyone. Welcome to, again, as Emma said, the first session of our 2023 book club. My name is Bruce Dixon, and I'm the new co-CEO of the Trauma Research Foundation. And on behalf of our board of directors, our staff, our partners, our panelists, we'd like to welcome you all today and thank you for going on this wonderful journey with us today. So you might be able to tell I seem to be perspiring a little bit around my head. It's not because I'm nervous under the lights, but I'm checking in from Costa Rica on the Caribbean coast. And the place that I'm staying in doesn't have air conditioning. So I'm in a nice little room and I am roasting. So just wanted to put that out there. But also would ask everyone to let us know where you're checking in from. So in the YouTube comments, just let us know where you're checking in from. Also did want to, as we're sort of gathering, just wanted to give a quick overview of sort of, why TRF, Trauma Research Foundation, exists, right? So we are a 501c3 nonprofit, and we really exist to support the implementation and the sort of execution of optimal modalities, treatments, and methods to support and really helping those globally, adults and children, heal from traumatic events. So that's why we exist. And clearly today we're here to talk about The Body Keeps the Score as this sort of seminal work that was put out in the world that has really led us to some clear opportunities for healing. So with that, I just really wanted to say thank you for joining us. Stay in touch, share your thoughts, your comments, ideas, partnerships. I'll throw a little chat in for we are a 501c3 nonprofit. So we are able to take donations. So if anyone's so inclined to really support our work, feel free to do that as well. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Emma and look forward to connecting again at some other point. So Emma, take it away.
Thank you so much, Bruce. Today's session, like Bruce said, is the first episode of this 6-part series. Each week brings together as many as 15 panelists to discuss The Body Keeps the Score by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk. During the final episode on Thursday, March 30th, the author will join our conversation for a live Q&A session, and we certainly hope that you will all be there with us. So we invite our virtual community to participate in the discussion. Feel free to use the YouTube chat function to share your comments throughout the session. Our team at TRF are all tuning in with you, and we'll be sharing some comments after each discussion question. If you have trouble commenting, make sure that you are subscribed to the Trauma Research Foundation YouTube channel. All right, so we'll be sharing information about each panelist as they respond to their first question. Panelists are invited to apply from anywhere in the world and from every background. We truly welcome voices representing a diversity of experiences and thoughts. If you have any interest in participating as a panelist during episodes 2 through 5, we will provide the application at the end of this discussion. We'll select panelists for our final episode from the list of panelists from the first 5 episodes. All right, so to help ground us in this conversation, we're happy to offer a study guide as a companion to your reading. Please download the study guide from the link in the chat. And I'm excited to introduce the TRF team that makes this production possible. Pat, our media manager, Connor, our media specialist, Laura, our programs manager, myself, and my amazing colleague, Liz. We are both program specialists, and we both work on this book club. And of course, Bruce, our co-CEO. So there's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes, and I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that time, attention, and care from each and every one of us. And now to introduce our book club moderators, Ronnie Ang and Achara Tarfa. So our first moderator, Achara Tarfa, is a certified trauma recovery coach supervisory level with the International Association of Trauma Recovery Coaches. She's a board member of PATH, a program to recover from addiction and its underlying trauma utilizing an internal family systems informed approach. As a trauma survivor herself, Achara founded compassionate coaching for complex trauma to support other survivors and serves as a 2-term elected district supervisor, where she brings a self-led, trauma-informed voice to local policy. She enjoys spending time eating the food of her mother's country, Thailand, and is always up for an adventure. Welcome, Achara. Thank you so much for being here. Our second moderator, Ronnie Ang, is an EMDR and expressive arts play therapist, a group facilitator certified by the Trauma Healing Institute and the president-elect of the American Counseling Association in New York. He's a community advocate on the board of a 501c3 nonprofit focusing on the inner city, where his mission is to empower marginalized children against intergenerational and racial trauma, as well as internalized oppression and vicarious trauma. He has also lived on 3 continents and is often invited to speak on the biopsychosocial impact of spiritual health and vice versa by local leadership around the world. Currently, Ronnie is writing a PhD dissertation on purpose-filled worldviews and other post-traumatic growth factors that strengthen resiliency and hardiness for military families and international workers with third culture kids in dangerous environments. Thank you both for being here in support of this community, Achara and Ronnie. So today we will be discussing part 1, the rediscovery of trauma from The Body Keeps the Score. In chapters 1 through 3 of the book, we learn about the physical impacts of trauma on the brain and body and the need to train the brain to recognize when it's safe. So Achara and Ronnie, if you would like to take it from here.
Was that going to me, Ronnie, or was that going to you? I'm just wondering. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, wait, this is where we transition to our slides here. Can we move to the next slide? Yeah, that's ours. Thank you. All right. So we just have some wellness recommendations. Just a content warning. Some of these topics are difficult. So please, we want you to take care of you. Feel free to take a pause, or if you need to, just step away, just to take care of your system, because we all really value your voice, and we want you to know that your voice is important to us. So if you need to step away for any reason to regain your voice, please feel free to do that. So self-care is very important. At any time, we recommend you to just maybe get a drink of water or stretch, do some breathing, name what's happening for you, maybe orient yourself a bit, and just really relax in the present moment, and check in with your parts, see if you can be present with us, because we're here to have some fun and discuss a great book. Next slide, please. All right, Ronnie, I'm going to hand it over to you to take this first question.
Sure. Thank you so much, Achara.
You're welcome.
This is the first question, chapter 1. In talking about the case of Bill, Aaron Kolk paraphrases a quote from Freud. He says, "I believe this man is suffering from memories. Oftentimes, trauma symptoms are mistaken for other mental health conditions. How do you think the fields of counseling and psychiatry can better prevent these harmful mistakes from continuing to occur?" So we have several participants raising their hands. Joey Hayes, can we start with you?
Hello. So in thinking about this, I think of 2 pertinent factors. One is believing in complex PTSD and symptoms that come from long-term trauma that might not seem as aggressive as single incident trauma. And also just believing our clients. I was in the Navy, and when I went to get treated and I said my symptoms were from a trauma, I was told it was not a trauma because I didn't almost die, and pretty much repeatedly gaslit into thinking that my experience wasn't true. So that just re-traumatizes people when we don't listen to people about their own experiences.
Thank you, Joey. First of all, thank you for observing, but also thank you for contributing your own personal experience. A lot of times, Bessel speaks about how complex developmental trauma begins in childhood and it's not even about the acute single incidents. So thank you for that. Can we hear from Elijah?
Hi, yeah, this is Villia Ball. I really like what Joey was saying, believing clients. Me reading this chapter spoke to me as kind of transported me as a young therapist in training. I'm a psychologist. And when Dr. Kolk was talking about talking, really listening with a different ear and understanding, that actually spoke to me when I had my first client who said, please never lose this aliveness and this interest in clients, because when I was going to experience clinicians, I was not feeling like I was seen and heard and understood that much. I was feeling treated just as another client. So from the very beginning, Dr. Kolk is showing how it's important even to build his first client, how it's important to be seen, heard, and understood, and how his curiosity was taking him to clients' charts and looking into their stories. And even, I think in one of the chapters, he's talking about how people were waiting for ECT, and when they were listened and heard and understood by him, he were kind of wondering, do I even need to go to ECT and maybe lose some memories when I feel like I was significant and important to be listened to? So that's, I'm sorry, just don't want to hijack the time. Just that's my passion about this chapter that came out. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming out strong.
Listening.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming out strong in these book clubs. And so we have many more hands, but we're going to continue on to question 2. That's perfectly fine. And we can continue on this discussion. So Atra, can you second question?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Next slide, please. Why is it important to treat both body and minds in survivors of trauma? Sarah, I saw that your hand was next. So are you leaving it raised for this question?
I would love to. I'd love to give some 2 cents here. It's great to hear folks. I think what I work with folks who have a developmental disability label, but the more work that we do, we understand they actually probably don't have a developmental disability. They've got developmental trauma. So I think when we think about incorporating both the mind and body, we can stop overemphasizing this cognitive space and really grow our understanding beyond behaviorism into our neuroscience perspective. And a friend of mine named this, I just want to share this metaphor that we can see behavior as the fruit. If your apple tree is rotten, you don't go spray every single apple, you get to the soil. So I think our psychiatrists, our counselors, I think folks who want to emphasize the body work can really start to appreciate the fruit. We need to honor survival strategies before we start to shift them. So appreciate the fruit and really tend to the root. And I think we can get there if we all understand that the mind and body are not separate. We don't want to continue disintegrating folks. We really want to lean into integration. And of course, I think this book is a first step on getting us there.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that you shared that metaphor. So thank you very much. Yeah, definitely. Wonderful visualization to help understand that. Is it Christiane? Yeah, hi.
Yeah, hi. I'm a little bit nervous myself, so I'm just going to try and regulate myself as we're talking here. For me, my experience had been very much that it was all in my head, what I was experiencing. And so that brought on an extra level of shame and guilt, which then put on another layer of trauma. And so when I read this book, just having the words and the information and the research and that awareness that it is in the body, and the body sends the messages to the mind, and then the mind speaks back to the body, and this just amazing introduction to how the brain works and how we can all continue to survive, even though we're in functional freeze, even though we're dissociating. And therefore, because we're still functioning, there is this disbelief from others. Well, you can't possibly be suffering from what you're explaining because you're walking around and you're functioning in society. But that the ability for Bessel van der Kolk to allow you to shine that light on how you're really showing up on a daily basis and how exhausting it is to carry around that invisible backpack of so much trauma that other people have been invalidating for years through the DSM. So it's absolutely vital that we treat both body and mind, and that we have a bespoke approach, because everybody's different.
Everybody's different. Yeah. And what the way I present is going to be different the way somebody else presents. And so, yeah, I love that also, that visual of the invisible backpack. We make so many decisions, or, we have our own biases, and we move forward from there. But we have to understand a lot of people with a lot of invisible backpacks. So we'll move on to the next question. And Ronnie, I'll pass that back to you as we move down. Thank you.
Thank you, Atra. Question number 3. During this time period when van der Kolk was learning from Vietnam veterans and becoming aware of the lack of knowledge available in the field, why do you think society turned a blind eye to the realities of trauma, especially for the veteran population? Dr. Margaret.
I think that it's really important to realize that society doesn't want to take responsibility for the many ways that it contributes to trauma. We live in a society globally, I think, where oftentimes it's easier to blame the victim as opposed to looking at what could have been done, A, to prevent trauma, and B, to help people through the trauma to respond. And so, it has to do with our model of healthcare, our model of trauma victims use avoidance. Oftentimes they don't talk about trauma. They will tend to be quiet, bottle it up, and initially not bring it up. And we not only don't look for it, we don't ask about it. I find with my clients, even when I ask, oftentimes they won't bring it up right away. I'll ask, about if I'm working with a child, have there been any traumatic exposures? The parents will say, oh no, nothing major. And then maybe a week later, 2 weeks later, something very major comes out. So avoidance, trauma victim. I know we're supposed to use the word survivor, but I like the word victim until someone becomes a survivor. The trauma victim tends to bottle it up, use avoidance, and society doesn't want to hear about it because it traumatizes others to hear about it. And it also basically says, what are you going to do about it?
Absolutely. You have to recognize the hurt that's been done before you move forward. Otherwise, you're invalidating the experience. And we ask Chiara to contribute. Or Chiara? I don't know if you're on mute. If you can unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, yes, thank you. So what came to mind, this question is when Dr. van der Kolk was saying that that the fields for studying trauma are basically use the lens of the technology that they have at the time to treat it, and the lens through which they were looking at the veteran population was so narrow and skewed by the times and them not understanding trauma that society, again, echoing what she said before, didn't have a language or a perception framework to even see the trauma, much less do anything about it. And then the other thing that comes to mind, I work in schools with underserved children, and a lot of them are traumatized. And Dr. van der Kolk used the word pseudo certainties in talking about psychiatry. And I would say that a lot of the adults surrounding traumatized children have these pseudo certainties about their behaviors and about their diagnoses, and that I feel like the pseudo certainties surrounding people with trauma also prevents the kind of exacerbates the blind eye, just the status quo of what their diagnosis is, what medications they're on, what the treatment of the symptoms are.
Thank you for that contribution. We also have quite a bit of chatter on the YouTube channel. I want to recognize that very stimulating discussion between G. Clark and Patricia Matos in regards to the DSM and Freud. And, it's a very interesting conversation going on there. But let's move on to question number 4.
Chapter 2, question 1, actually. So we're going to move on to this chapter. And in what ways might we shift our inner equilibrium and physiology without the use of medication? Dr. Keisha, I'd love to hear your answer for this. I've been waiting to hear what you got to say.
I think this is a beautiful question, particularly after what we just looked at with the veterans. And I want to just tie in the segue. In page 20 of the book, Dr. Bessel writes, "War is not the only calamity that leaves human lives in ruins. For many people, the war begins at home. Each year, about 3 million children in the United States are reported as victims of child abuse and neglect. For every soldier who serves in a war zone abroad, there are 10 children who are endangered in their own homes." This amazing book was published in 2014. We know so much has happened since then. So when we look at this question in terms of how can we begin to deal with this massive problem without the use of medication, this is where I think this research is so important, because our society within the United States and globally, we are too heavily reliant on pharmaceuticals. And we're seeing the repercussions of that. We don't have to look to 2014. We can look at the pandemic. We can look at the massive issues we have with people who have formed addictions through drugs. And if we start to realize that this is bigger than veterans, this is also impacting our children, then we have to begin to think of more holistic ways. And that's why I find such encouragement in the somatic therapies, in polyvagal, in yoga, in these processes that acknowledge that the mind and the body have experienced trauma and grief needs to be witnessed. So when we come into these spaces and we start building community and we start to collectively share, my hope is that we start to get into spaces where we start to collectively grieve, we start to collectively sing, we start to collectively dance, we start to collectively move, and we grow this into something powerful, because that is what's in us as well.
Yeah, I really respond to you incorporating, the connectedness that occurs through singing. Singing is different than just regular speech. And so when we go and we have therapy and talk and so forth, it's different than actually singing, and the healing that, singing actually touches 8 points of our brain. And so that vagal exercise we get from those tones, I love that you brought that into the answer to this question. And I think I 100% couldn't agree with you more, Dr. Keisha. Thank you so much. I see Adelita. I hope I said that right. Please correct me.
Perfectly. Thank you so much. I was hoping and pray I could answer this one. This is near and dear to my heart, and I think that I'm going to repeat what most of us already know, but maybe some people on YouTube or people that haven't read the book yet may not be aware, is that the conventional ways of treating trauma, it's not working. There's complex trauma, there's resistant trauma that it's not being effective, these conventional treatments. And what I mean by conventional treatments, I'm talking about talk therapy alone and medication. So if you go to the Veterans Administration and you look for PTSD treatments, that's the only 2 things that are available. And if you continue to research, you're going to see that that is the norm. That's what is taught in schools. I'm in school right now, and I'm saying, hey, there's more to treatments for trauma than meets the eye. So we're talking about, I am a very big advocate of a neurofeedback training. I'm studying it. There's a lot that neuroimaging has done for this field. And we're talking also about simple ways, nature, spirituality, movement, nutrition, mindfulness, volunteering, caring for a pet. These are just to name a few. Some are paid, some are free. Until we exhaust this list, we shouldn't just go jump into the medication, because the pharmaceutical industry is very powerful and they have a lot of resources, but we have to use our voice to promote what nature has always been doing for us, which is healing us through simple practices like walking, praying, helping other people. So that's my contribution.
Thank you for that contribution, Adelita. You know, it's really resonating with even just the audience that's watching now, this question. We've got lots of comments from YouTube on this. We have Susan Izat, I hope I'm saying that right, that she says, I've been using homeopathic psilocybin for several months and feel it is helping me to get the roots of my trauma without any side effects. And so we're talking something natural. We're using that sort of metaphor earlier that was mentioned. And it's another, like Annie McRae, she was talking about Dr. Keisha's comment about grief needs to be witnessed, right? And there's that connectedness of healing there. And she says all forms of grief need to be witnessed. You can have grief without trauma, but you cannot have trauma without grief. And I think that's so wise and so true. How about we go ahead and do the next question? Ronnie, I'll hand that over to you. Question 2, chapter 2.
Great, thank you. What thoughts do you have about traumatic reenactments and the purpose they may serve trauma survivors? And we have here, is it Elijah? I'm sorry, I mispronounced your name for the first time. What was that again? Okay, okay. Let's go with Heaven. Okay.
Everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I said I think it's important. Oh, and just introduce myself. I know I look kind of young, so we're like, what do you know about his brain? I study Cog-Sci at Carnegie Mellon, and I have a minor in neurocomputation, and I'm also a major in philosophy and another minor in linguistics, which actually is really interesting and helps you understand the brain a lot and in lots of different types of ways. More so like the function. But I said I think it's important to recognize what happened to you, but it's not always like, in my personal experience, it's not always best to do it right after the fact. Sometimes, like for example, with cognitive behavioral therapy, you have to wait until you're ready, to say it without it being too painful, because then it can kind of create the opposite effect as far as helping you process and deal with it. But on the same hand, I do feel like we can't start the healing process until we accept what happens. And of course, that happens by speaking it out loud. And it also allows us to kind of look at it objectively. So yeah, as far as like I said, one of my minors is neurocomputation. And so the brain can get stuck in these patterns of thinking. And so that's why you don't want to repeat it too much. Or if you do repeat it, also repeat it with affirmations like, I felt, like distance yourself from it and pull yourself out of it. Like, you don't have to, just because you are even reenacting, you have to make sure that you recognize that this is not happening right now, because your peripheral nervous system is always going to react like as if it is right now. And
I hear that dual awareness is important to recognize it's not happening at the same time. Did you get a quick comment from Dr. Margaret?
Yes, in my experience, people reenact because they're trying to understand. They're trying to get, in essence, empower themselves to be able to manage and handle what happened to them. And I think that certain types of reenactment can, from the survivor's perspective or the victim's perspective, feel therapeutic, but can also be very dangerous. So you really have to be careful. I really like what was said about the body work and the alternative opportunities, because there are ways to reenact without putting yourself in danger, but only when you're ready. And it ideally in a guided kind of way. But reenactment, I'll tell you what, it feels great. It's fantastic. People who have put themselves in incredibly dangerous situations, they crave that experience. It brings them to life, and it's their opportunity to feel empowered over the very high level of disempowerment and helplessness that the trauma left them in. And that's all I have to say.
Well, that's quite a bit already. So thank you, Dr. Margaret. And I find a lot of comments in the YouTube section talking about EMDR and other modalities like that. So thank you for that. Atra.
You want to move on to the next question, Ronnie?
Yes, please.
Okay. We'll go to question 3. Before I do, I would just want to add that this book is the reason why I did neurofeedback therapy. I read this book and I had no idea about what that was. And about a year and a half ago, I discovered that, and neurofeedback therapy has been transformative in my own trauma healing. And so I see comments mentioning there's someone here who's a student writing their undergrad thesis on dance as an ancillary trauma treatment. And they're a long time dancer choreographer, and that's the stuff that we're talking about, right? So so exciting to hear. There was a comment earlier about I think it was Annalita that was sharing, like, she's a student now, and these are not the things that she's learning. Like, there are things now that it's out that can help and heal trauma that we're talking about, and some of the things that were mentioned at the end of this book. And it's just encouraging to my soul to be in a space with all of you that are working in these modalities, that there's no longer going to be this or that as an option, but hey, there's a lot of dessert at this table, right? So thank you all for sharing. So chapter 2, question 3, how does our use of the DCM correlate with the brain disease model and the 4 fundamental truths it overlooked? Who would like to take this question? I see Christiane's hand. Is that correct? Yeah.
It is. Hi. So for me, from my experience, the use of the DSM is the start point, and it has been the start point historically for a long time, and it's the kind of immediate pathway to medication and not necessarily to the more informed trauma approaches in terms of somatic integration and experiences like that. Page 21, for real change to take place, the body needs to learn that the danger has passed and to live in the reality of the present. The DSM is more about what's in the brain, what's in the mind, but we now know so much more about how the body and the somatic experiences, cold water therapy, movement, nutrition, tapping, breathing, all of the senses that for so long we've been disconnected from because of the pushing down the medication route all of the time. You feel depressed, medication. You're not coping well with life, medication. We've become so disconnected from ourselves because of the DSM. And I'm just looking at my notes here. We have the ability to regulate our own physiology, including any involuntary responses, which we didn't think we had before. So that's one of the key truths that's been overlooked.
Yeah. I have no words. I can't echo and agree more. Yeah. Thank you for that commentary and answer. Dr. Keisha.
You know what? I see a comment in the chat that someone who hasn't spoken has raised a hand. So I'm happy to defer and let them speak, and I can come in after.
Okay, wonderful. Who is it that has not spoken yet? That's got their hand raised. I see, is it Rachel? Rachel, have you answered a question yet?
I changed my name had been under my daughter's name, so I just changed it to my actual name. So I have answered the question. I just changed it.
So
So yes, we'll defer back to Dr. Keisha.
Okay. Nope.
That works. Look at this respect and courtesy we got in this room of trauma survivors and helpers and healers. Wow. All right, Dr. Keisha, the floor is yours.
Yes. So I loved what my colleague said earlier. Again, as we highlight in the book also, I think this is the third chapter where Dr. Kolk really highlights how things just sort of shifted, I think around the 60s, early 70s, and we still haven't turned back. In fact, there's a great documentary out called White Coats that looks at how the pharmaceutical culture has just sort of put its tentacles in everything. And I think the most important thing I could do with this time is highlight Alexis Fox. Sis, not only should you focus on dance, don't let anyone tell you differently. As you continue to swim upstream, do things that may not be the traditional method, dance is a powerful thing. It's historical. It's in our DNA. It's something our ancestors tied down. And while a lot of the science has overlooked it, it does not make it any less powerful. So as you're writing your papers, as you go further with this, continue to stand confidently in being different. Because for those of us who choose to dance to our own rhythm within this field, we deal with a lot of pushback because we're highlighting things like the chapter says are written off as alternative medicines or different styles. But then something like COVID happens and suddenly we realize medications aren't enough. And all the things our ancestors knew, dance has been around since the beginning of humanity. So I am delighted to read that there are people who are encouraged by this. And that's what I want to spend my few seconds on saying. Alexis and anyone else like Alexis, run as fast and as hard as you can in those different directions. Time will catch up with you. The money will chase you. Believe me.
Thank you, Dr. Keisha. Thank you for your voice. Rachel, the floor is yours. What are your thoughts on this question?
Thank you. So going back to what my colleague said about regulating your own physiology. So I go into schools and teach young kids that they can regulate their own physiology, and they get it. They get it so much better than adults do. And they gravitate towards it. The more they're traumatized, the more they gravitate towards the breathing and the mindfulness and yoga poses and the power of doing it together in a group. I feel like, especially mindfulness and breath work, it tends to be taught like this is what you can do for yourself. But we have taught what children have taught us is that they want to do it in a group together. They want to see their friends breathing. They want to see their friends yoga poses. They want to, and I think that's a big lesson for us as adults, that it's, easy to go off and listen to your mindfulness app or whatever, or do your own trauma therapy. But echoing Dr. Keisha, the community part of it, the dance, the yoga, the breathing, the whatever your modality is, the power of community in that is really big.
Yeah, I can't agree with it. Sounds like some of the truths, the fundamental truths you're talking about, like number 1 and number 4, about our capacity to destroy is matched by our capacity to heal one another by restoring relationships and communities. And then also we can change the societal environment in which people can feel safe, heal, and thrive. And people often don't sort of think about that with children, right? And you're changing that societal environment and how powerful that is at that level. We'll take one more answer to this question, and then I'll pass it over to Ronnie for the next question. I think, Joey, you had your hand up.
Sorry, I wasn't unmuted. The thing that this brings up for me is that sometimes the DSM this goes back to what I said last time, is used to deny people's experiences. You don't check these boxes, so you don't have this problem. And in the situation I had mentioned earlier, the DSM diagnostic criteria was used against me for something that I felt I was clearly experiencing. And I think that's a big problem with the DSM is we put so much stock in diagnoses that we use it to deny people's problems. And we also use it to pigeonhole people. So you're schizophrenic. This can also be trauma. But a lot of people have both. They may have a psychotic disorder, but they also have trauma in their past. And medication is only going to do so much. I saw that with a lot of clients when I worked in an inpatient psychiatric hospital, is that their trauma hung them up on being able to heal their psychotic disorders.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing some of your professional and lived experience on that. Ronnie, I'll pass it over to you. Chapter 2, or I think it's actually, yeah.
And thank you, Atra. One of the comments that stood out for me in the YouTube chat was from Amy Brewer. And she says, yes, to dance. Dance was very important in my teenage daughter's healing from witnessing her father's death due to a hiking accident. So I just want to affirm all those who have spoken about dance, and especially done in a community. Dr. Keisha was spot on when she talked about that, because even in the Asian cultures, you go to a park, you see everybody doing the Tai Chi, like 20 elderly people, and they firmly don't believe in going to see a therapist, and they're super healthy. They're living to like 100 years old plus, right? My own grandmother is like 97 right now, and all of my great grandparents lived over 100 pretty much. So certainly something there that we need to do more of. But thank you for that. As we look at the next question, we can go to the next slide here. Given what we know about flashbacks, why wouldn't we repeatedly talk about a traumatic experience and have that resolve the symptoms?
Yes, I've worked with survivors of school traumas, major school traumas. And one of the things I've emphasized over and over with them is that the trauma that they experienced is their story. It's their narrative. They decide if, when, how, where, and with whom they're going to share that story. They may have to talk to the police right afterwards, but that's it. It's so critically important to recognize that they have ownership of that story, that narrative, and they decide when they want to talk about it. Talking about it can be amazingly therapeutic at the right time. And it's so important to just be there, to be willing to listen when they talk about it. If they talk about it in minute detail, you know that it's frozen in their mind. On the other hand, if they don't want to talk about it, respect that. And methods, bringing them all together for debriefing, where they have to talk about it or where they're encouraged to talk about it and have other people talk about theirs, can re-traumatize them. So it's so important to recognize only it's their story. Talking about it can be amazingly therapeutic at the right time, but at the wrong time, it can be damaging. So that's all I have.
Yeah, I mean, certainly damaging, especially when the part of their brain that regulates time and gives them a sense of the movement and passage of time is offline. Let's get some comments from Adelita.
Thank you. Well, these flashbacks, we can't really talk the reptilian brain, and you can't talk the limbic system or the amygdala out of hyperactivity. You can't talk it out of it. So good luck, right? You're trying to talk to the cognitions, but that's surface level. That's talk therapy. I am studying to be a therapist. Right? I see clients and I see how just talking to them, you can be reactivating these problems. if we're not going deeper, where we are working with the nervous system somatically in different levels. There's emotional level, there is cognitive level, there is physical level, movement, nutrition, and spiritual level for those that have that dimension. So there are many levels that we need to address, and we can't just talk your amygdala to stop being reactive.
I appreciate what Adelita shared about the physical and the spiritual dimensions. And even in the last question, we talked about DSM. And sometimes I think DSM stands for denies somatic manifestations, and it denies spiritual meanings. Right? So everybody who's focused on the DSM in their graduate school programs, please do explore some of the learnings that are out there. Even within the Trauma Research Foundation, I myself, I graduated from the Traumatic Stress Studies program, where we talked a lot about those different somatic interventions, SMART and so forth. So do explore that on the website. One of the things I also looked at in terms of the YouTube chats, right? A lot of other good things. Maddie said that she's a horticultural therapy student, and she's so excited to tie in somatic work, polyvagal education, and biofilial. I really appreciate the encouragement into the lesser known modalities. So we have to really encourage students, the next generation of healers in the world. And a lot of times, so my work, I focus a lot on the social determinants of mental health abroad in the middle income countries, low income countries. And you see how people in the United States, we're very excited about medication, overly so in many instances, and we're trying to push that paradigm into other cultures. And yet we've seen the rates of anxiety, depression, all the other mental health disorders in the DSM-5 not being particularly resolved. So we have a broken system, a half-baked solution, and yet we're pushing it across as if we know it all. So certainly, I'll get off my soapbox there for a second, but Christiane, I see you nodding your head, so carry the torch there.
Yeah, absolutely. That there's this obsession with the need to fix it. We medicate it early, we solve the problem, we nip it in the bud, but we don't. We're just putting a lid on it because we're not actually encouraging people to connect with themselves, to learn about their own bodies, their own lived experiences. They're not taught how to nourish themselves, whether that be spiritually, physically, connection with other people. And we're pushing people so far away from connecting with themselves that we're just making that gap wider and wider instead of making it possible to reconnect with self. When we talk about the question here about the flashbacks and the talking, this need to fix it, often I found with clients, they can read almost like a script and describe the flashback as if they're reading from a piece of paper. There is no connection with the body at all. There's this dissociation because they're living with this flashback every day. I think we think of flashbacks as being things that stop people in their tracks, when, you can just be running this movie in your head as you're walking around every day and nobody realizes. So allowing people that space where you validate and you hold the space for them whilst they drop into their bodies to actually connect with where the trauma's hiding. I use a modality called brain spotting, which uses a brain spot point. And we use a resource spot and also an activation spot. So we can make sure that the client feels safe when they're ready, but they don't need to say anything to me. I've worked with one client and I still don't know what her story is, but she has gone on to set up her own business and she's functioning and contributing and enjoying her life. So it's so important that body experience, the somatic side.
That's wonderful. And certainly there's so much to be said for the other components that we're missing. And I'm looking again at the YouTube comments, and Megan spoke about how their entire life they were scared to dance or sing at all, even alone for fear of being judged. Since reading the book, Body Keeps a Score, just they have naturally started dancing and singing during everyday activities and singing deep songs out loud in such a different way than just listening to the songs that touch you. So really remembering that there is a deeper component there, and doing it in community, doing it in a way that's more meaning than usual. Very important. Let's have another panelist speak up. Heaven. Heaven,
Sorry, I was trying to get in line for the next question. I mean, yeah.
Okay, that's fine. How about Elijah?
Yeah, I just have a brief comment. It was really interesting to me from the research studies, brain scans, where flashbacks activate the right hemisphere and deactivate the left hemisphere. So it's the left hemisphere where the language is, right? And if we activate with a flashback, or we bring flashbacks through processing, and here our client is stuck in a speechless terror, so to speak, because left hemisphere is deactivated, and that other kind of brain area where visual cortex is activated as if trauma is happening in the moment. So I agree. I forgot the name of doctor who was saying, yes, probably it's good to find the time when it's good to process these memories, but otherwise we leave people in a speechless terror if we activate flashbacks with our processing and not resourcing clients and not giving them tools to handle that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that a lot of times people forget that there is that inability to speak when the brokerage area is impacted.
Yeah, it just struggle with the brokerage area where people, even some clients would say, my spouse is so upset with me that I cannot tell about my trauma. And the spouse would say in couples therapy, why you are not telling me? And an affected person, let's say a veteran, wouldn't even know why he can't provide all this information that is being asked. And just psychoeducating people to understand, to experience trauma, that's a huge relief to them. You can't do that because your left hemisphere is shut, and how to help you to find words of some kind of significance to describe what you experience.
Yeah, it's a lot of play and expressive arts, and then being able to even sit somebody down in front of a sand tray and able to move those miniatures around, or you know, we're talking about the experience with Kaufman's area 19, right? You know, the visual cortex is stimulated in such a way that they're just revisiting that as it's happening.
Yeah.
So it's a very experiential thing. And I've seen a lot of good work done in terms of just drawing something out, and that being that manifestation of their stuck experiences.
Focusing on that safety, creating safety for the body and mind in the moment. Yeah.
And so going back to some of the comments in the YouTube channel, Laurie spoke about working with clients 30 or more years ago with many DSM diagnoses of psychosis 1, often suggested that those symptoms were usually responses to trauma. And ESTAR has the comment here, something near and dear to my heart, working with neurodevelopmentally challenged children. They speak about adults with autism often sharing with them that they have been told it's not autism, it's trauma, or vice versa, based on the DSM. And they appreciate the comments about how there can be multiple diagnoses. So wonderful commentary there. Atra, can we go to the next question?
I'd love to. What's up next? Chapter 3, question 2. How might constantly elevated stress hormones impact an individual? I don't know anything about this in my own personal life, so I'm just going to sit here and learn. That was complete sarcasm. So really just want to see some hands, and Heaven, we'll let you go ahead and lead us off on this question, please.
Yes, so this is actually something I was excited about because it's very personal to me. I have systemic lupus erythematosus, which is basically where your autoimmune system attacks itself whenever you get a code or like any type of stressor, whether that be external, like physical stressor, or even internal stress. It can cause me to flare up. And so, for example, a couple months ago, I got a cold, and from that cold, my lupus flared up, and it caused me to have a heart attack. There's like internal swelling around my heart, and I was also pretty stressed out. Being in the hospital sucks. But even before that, like basically when I first got diagnosed with lupus, it's always been something that was present in my mind of just how our mental state and our stress levels can impact our physical body. Just to like touch back on a few other panelists, I really appreciated them talking about the importance of moving our body is a way of healing. It definitely is, just because they're so connected, the body and the mind. There's actually a study that just came out. It was just published today in Nature. And it's talking about how mental states can have a profound impact on, how sick we get and how well we recover. And so I'll just read this little thing right here and then I'm done. But it says, neuroscientist Catherine Dulac, her team showed that activating a brain structure, the hypothalamus, triggered fever and appetite loss, even in the absence of a pathogen, which I found is really interesting. I can put the link in YouTube. But yeah, so.
Thank you for sharing that. And thank you for sharing the link in this article that you read that just came out today and some parts of, your story. I'm so appreciative, especially the lived experience. I find that when we share our stories, that impacts a lot of us the most. So thank you. Any other hands raised on this question? Yeah, so I've got some. Here we go. All right, so we'll go with Dr. Margaret. I haven't had some time with you, so we'll go with you and get your hand up.
Okay. I'll get short. I think that the elevated stress hormones put a person in a state where they're seeking whatever they can to, in essence, restore equilibrium. So it can lead to substances. And I think that may be a factor in substance abuse. Or it could be food. It could be whatever, but the body wants to get back to a state of equilibrium and searches for whatever it can or whatever it's used in the past to do that. And that's, again, where therapy is so important. I think this is an area where especially talk therapy can be incredibly helpful because it can help a person develop insight into how they do kind of try to bring themselves out of that chronic high stress state.
Yeah, it sounds like some insight is helpful. And I use the modality of internal family systems, and one of the whole goals is to be self-led. And that sounds a lot like what you're talking about there. I just want to also, I'm just going to lead with intuition here, but I feel I want to name, we talk a lot about body movement, and as trauma survivors, I find that if we feel like we can't do, like say somebody was listening to us today and maybe they haven't stepped into a space where they've entered any sort of healing modality, or, maybe not, they can't afford a therapist or whatever the reason is as far as resourcing. I just want to name and let people know that you start where you start. Right. So if it's just, if you can't get out and walk, maybe I can do some stretches in my bed or whatever. It's not a one size fits all. And so if you're listening to us today, please hear, compassion from us and encouragement from us about that when we refer to body movement and so forth, because somebody had wrote in the YouTube comments, shame is a silencer, right? shame is a silencer and it isolates us. So we're speaking a lot about connectedness today. Adelita, I see you up on my screen next for this question.
Yes. So when we have this hormones running rampant through the system, over time, it overtaxes the body, right? It overtaxes the body. It drains the resources from the body. It drains our ability to regulate emotions. It drains the immune system function. It drains our ability to regulate our circadian rhythms. So we're, like Dr. Margaret said, we're out of balance. So to find our job is to find that balance and bring it back to emotional regulation so that our immune system can go back into healing mode instead of trying to fight some bear or some trauma or some fear that is really gonna suck the energy out of the system.
Yeah, thank you for saying that and for naming that. Thank you so much. I see Joey, you wanted to answer this, and then I also saw Dr. Keisha after that. Go ahead, Joey.
So the thing that this makes me think is it goes both ways. Having post-traumatic stress causes elevated stress hormones, but elevated stress hormones over a long period of time also start causing traumatic symptoms. When I was in the military, I wasn't in a combat field, but it was a very high pressure, high stress field. And you would start seeing these symptoms of trauma show up in people because we were constantly exhausted, mistreated, given really high standards that we weren't supported in meeting, very competitive, and mental health in that community was terrible. And I think we also see the same thing with people who are living in poverty, people who experience institutionalized racism, is that they're living in this place where they're constantly being picked at. And so that you throw in big traumas in trying to cope with that, and you're just getting people who are absolutely always in fight or flight or freeze. And that's how they're living every day of their lives. And unfortunately, some of those situations are really hard to escape. They're not necessarily something that we can fix easily. So, and we start seeing health problems and other challenges, challenging relationships when we have these elevated stress hormones, either from trauma or from the little traumas of a challenging life. Littler. I don't want to call any traumas little.
Thank you for naming that, right? Trauma is how we, not necessarily the event, but the wounds we carry, according to Dr. Gabor, right? Mate. So thank you for naming that. Before I go to Dr. Keisha, I'm going to take some YouTube comments. Holstein, hope I pronounced that correctly, Aiken. There are so many autoimmune conditions that can affect elevated hormone levels that can mimic mental health symptoms such as depression and or anxiety. That's why complete physicals are important. And that's why I think someone else mentioned, polyvagal, like being informed of our nervous system and so forth. Lynn Baker says, curious about stress levels when the individual does not recognize the stress. I would love to hear recommendations for those stuck in denial. So maybe be thinking about that a little bit as you answer your question. So, and then another person had said the allostatic load changes brain structure in early stages. I think we sort of alluded to that earlier. But yeah, thank you, YouTube audience, for chiming in with your comments and giving us some space to have some deeper thought to the discussion. You are appreciated. Dr. Keisha.
This question is actually really near and dear to my heart because I work in racial trauma and gun violence trauma. And a lot of the work we rely on is directly connected to Dr. Howard C. Stevenson and his research on processing trauma in the body in the moment, particularly when we're looking at racially stressful encounters. And over the years of doing this work, one thing I consistently see from the highest level of C-suite executives to janitors is that there is a historical aspect that seems to be the word, the thematic word of this conversation, the historical aspect of these handed down traumas. And when we talk about trauma as an elevated stress response, if we're looking at someone who represents as Black or is treated to the Black experience, one of the things that constantly handicaps them is the inability to express their rage, is the inability to acknowledge the depth of their anger. And so you can imagine an elevated stress response without a proper outlet because they don't want to be stigmatized as an angry Black woman, man, etc. And I cannot tell you how often I hear that specific quote when I am working with someone who is clearly describing an incident at work, a passive aggressive or an overly aggressive or just an outright racist encounter. And they have to be the one to swallow it because they don't want to be seen as angry, or they are concerned that if the racism, which has power, falls upon them, they will be unemployed or they will be chastised in a way that will significantly impact their ability to provide a quality of life for their family or for themselves. So when we talk about how this might impact the body, I just want us to include the structural, like Joey said, the structural, the systematic processes, systems, ecosystems around that individual that further catalyze the experience. Like, it's one thing to be stressed, it's a whole other thing to be stressed and understand that you have no recompense because the system supports it, because this is your supervisor, because you've already made this complaint to HR. Yes, yes, yes. We are telling the full truth on this conversation. And so when we talk about processing, I think we also need to really start looking at what are the mechanisms in place to protect after you process? Otherwise, we're just setting people up to go right back into the same situation, which is what a lot of us have seen who are practicing or who are mental health allies in this field.
I feel sometimes when you talk, I want to just get up from my chair and just like slam things and just, yes, like that's all I can do. Right. That's all I can do that. While you were speaking, you mentioned we had talked about COVID earlier, and I know I said I was going to go to somebody else, but I just wanted to give Sarah an opportunity. If you did want to answer this, just give me a head nod. No. Okay. So I'll just finish because I was going to not say what I'm going to say, but I'll go ahead and take it and say it and then pass it over to Ronnie. But just in relation to COVID and how I was raised in a single parent home, and how the under resources of my immigrant mother in America in a single parent home, and how it was no might constantly elevated stress level. It was a constantly elevated stress level, and how that impacted me and impacted my home. And then during COVID, when the schools had shut down and there was a lot of single parent homes that could not teach their kids. And so then what happens they can't go to their job and they can't work and they can't teach their kid. And so there's so many, just even thinking about COVID and how that elevated stress level impacted us as individuals, So I just want to name that from just what you were saying. So thank you so much. I'll go ahead and pass it over to Ronnie, and this will be our last question, I believe, Ronnie.
Yes, thank you for that. And I also want to echo my great gratitude to Dr. Keisha's comments because, being a person of color myself, I always think, how can we actually elevate that conversation? There's certainly been a lot of dialogue about the racial tensions in the last couple of years with all the things that have been happening in society. They've been happening for decades, centuries. but hopefully we're getting to a place where we have a conversation in open forums, not feel the need to hold back any of our true feelings or really desires for change. And that goes for not only the African American community, but also even for myself, experiencing a lot of the AAPI hate that's been stirred up in the last couple of years in the pandemic, and a lot of the microaggressions that have become micro assaults and so forth in New York City, where I'm a born and raised New Yorker, really means that how do we become not just the invisible minority? How do we, as people who've experienced this in our lives, articulate those thoughts in a way that actually is heard by people who can be allies? So let's move to the last question of the day. Question 3, chapter 3. After reading the 3rd chapter titled Looking into the Brain, the Neuroscience Revolution, how would you explain individuals' seemingly big responses to stimuli in their environment, such as hearing a certain song or smelling a certain scent? We'll go with Sarah first.
Awesome. I'm excited for this question because this is my whole job. I like to talk, I'm a care for the caregivers. So what I do is I help educators, families, and human service professionals understand how these early childhood experiences impact our brain, our body, and our behavioral patterns. And part of my role is to just anchor in right here to talk about stop shaming and blaming, what I call the B word. Behaviors. And I cuss all the time, but that is a cuss word for me because I think it's an antiquated understanding and it's a harmful understanding, again, if we just stay there. So I really use Dan Siegel's hand model. And, obviously he talks about the hand brain, but I like to come all the way down here. We know it's our gut that is reading the room before our emotions or our brain or mind have any access to that. Trauma is stored in the here and now part of our brain so that a sight, a sound, a smell can flip that thinking brain offline and we can be driven by those survival strategies. So if we're going to understand that, if we're going to orient to people at the root versus the symptom, we know we have to connect before we correct. We have to connect in that emotional space because if we're not feeling safe internally in our relationships or our environments, we will be hijacked by those past experiences. And we don't want to shame and blame that. We want to start to get really curious with how might that have cued danger to the person's nervous system. And I think that's the vocabulary I'd like to get into. I try to stay away from jargon. I don't want to speak over people's heads because I think that is another trauma that we can experience, right? But I really like to anchor people in our understanding of the nervous system. So we can start getting more curious with what's going on. We know from Dr. Bessel Kolk that curiosity is only accessible when we're in a state of safety. But I think that's our work. How do we start to elicit more curiosity with ourselves and with our loved ones, our young people, so they can stop being shamed and blamed for really their survival strategy?
Yeah, and how do we even model it out, right? To be curious starts with the people who are so-called unaffected by these things. And if you are a person who can be a potential ally, express some curiosity and say, well, what is your lived experience like? How does this affect you? Tell me more about that. And as I'm looking at the YouTube comments, a couple of very good ones. Aleka Avant, microaggressions plus 100 paper cuts. So yeah, adding the insult to injury. Arter McKinley, oftentimes, I feel as if when these conversations are had, they focus on a particular standpoint that affects the general population, rather than specific demographics who are impacted the most by them. So yeah, certainly the emic versus etic viewpoints. Dr. Margaret, let me call on you to comment on this as well.
Yes, those questions. I love the phrase that Dr. Van der Koe put in one of his books, affect dysregulation. And for children, teenagers, and even adults, when they have those big reactions, something that should trigger a little anger triggers too much anger. Something that should logically trigger a little anxiety triggers too much. When you use that word, that phrase, affect dysregulation, it is so therapeutic. It helps them, we talk about shame and blame. It really helps them understand what that is. And as a trauma survivor, I was in a plane accident and it felt so good afterwards, so good to have big reactions. At times when something I feel bad for the telephone people that I dealt with, because that's where my big reactions came out. Sometimes an anonymous person who did something like a clerical person or an operator, and it would just feel so good to release that anger. It was, I recognized what I was doing. I stopped, but oftentimes those big reactions, part of it is because the trauma is held in the body. And the big reactions, if you're not releasing it through physical kinds of activities, those big reactions get it out. The problem with the big reactions is what they can do with the people around you. And that's where those big reactions, affect dysregulation, can destroy relationships, put an end to jobs. And so if I have anything to say, if you work with trauma victims, trauma survivors, let them have their big reactions, but help them learn how to recognize what the big reaction is and be able to bring themselves out of it. Because it's a lot, like with kids, it's like a seizure. Parents think that they can sit down and talk with a child when they're going through that. They can't. Because again, that part of the brain that would deal with language is not working. But just give them a comfort object, be there, whether it's a child or an adult. Let them have their big reaction. Don't hold it against them. Make sure that they're safe and you're safe. And don't fire them if you're an employer. Recognize that they might need some accommodations, a way of being able to escape when they're having a big reaction. Anyway, I like big reactions.
That's wonderful, Dr. Margaret. And, a lot of my work I actually do with the caregivers, looking at it from the family and community perspective. So how do we prevent compassion fatigue, burnout, vicarious trauma, things like that, but really can maintain that level of compassion for others. So Adelita, why don't I give you the last word?
Thank you. So how these big responses affect everybody. So there was a study that was done, and then here on page 40 of the book, right, we're discussing this wonderful book, The Body Keeps the Score. It explains that they did a study and they observed that it shows activation of the limbic area when people are having those big reactions. We call them flashbacks, hyperactivity, and all those things. So it's not like the people are trying to do that. It's almost like they can't help it, right? It's the brain, it's reacting and it's activating the visual cortex, the Broca's area, the amygdala. When all this stuff is happening, what happens is that the right side of the brain is emotional and it's hyperactive right now, and it can't really utilize the left side of the brain. So all these things are stuck in the neurology. It's in the brain. The person is not trying to be disruptive. The person is not trying to create havoc. It's not like the person lacks willpower. It's like over reacting, right? So the brain, it shows how these flashbacks can create these problems, and through neurofeedback and calming down the neurology, we can actually start to heal these big responses, because they're coming back, right? They're flashbacks because they want to heal, right? Things that don't heal, they return. They'll keep returning until asking to be healed. So that's where we bring the compassion and the understanding that it's in the brain. It's not their own doing.
Wow, that is very, very powerful. And I see that we actually do have a little bit more time. So let me throw this to Elijah. If you can make a quick comment.
Yeah, a quick comment. I totally agree with the previous person who just mentioned that automaticity that is stuck, and that high level of serotonin seems to dampen that fear response, and when our amygdala is almost like a defense shield, it detects, it has that blueprint from previous traumatic experiences, and then it detects that sound or smell and it constantly reacts. I'm just kind of curious, like this book is totally to get out of conventional means that are not working, such as medication and other ways of approach. I'm kind of wondering, are there research studies that would be addressing what types of activities and alternative approaches can heighten that level of serotonin? Or, for example, what are research studies that looking into placebo, that looks like placebo sometimes matches the impact of other remedies like medication? Sometimes placebo is equal to the impact of medication. So it's just kind of interesting to talk also about research studies and how to engage those alternatives of regular life activities that would be boosting that chemical balance and helping our amygdala, that little almond that helps us so much in so many situations, to help to warn us. But here in being stuck in trauma, it's just working too hard and causing so much problems for us.
Yeah, certainly we want to impact and influence the counselors out there, but also the researchers. And Dr. Vanderkolk is always talking about, about where the money is, right? If there's someone who's got $10 million in the bank right now and wants to fund some research, we can probably get something going. But certainly, whenever there is good research that's done out there, please send it across, and to share it. Rachel, do you have a study that you know of going on right now?
Well, I just wanted to say that breathwork, like if you Google breathwork or James Nestor's book called Breathe, there's lots of different breathwork, and it's free, easy, simple, always with you, that is proven to increase serotonin levels. Too long to explain here, but if you look up James Nestor and the Breathe book, he goes through step by step all the research.
Wonderful, thank you. And Christiane, you have the last comment of the day.
Wow, I'm very lucky, very lucky. From the big responses, this idea of being the sense of feeling safe and connected with self from an internal perspective, an external perspective, and then the between. These big responses can come from all of a sudden feeling a sense of connection that you haven't felt for sometimes ever. And then to actually have that feeling of safety can create this big response, which can be both really positive, but it can be also really, really negative. It can be a real gut-wrenching feeling, like you've been winded, like you've been blindsided, when this sense of injustice. And a lot of that can go back to our inner child wounds of, not feeling good enough, not feeling important, worthy, or lovable. But it is very much that limbic system response. It isn't logical that you would have such a big response in the moment to something, but all those experiences that you've had potentially from toxic stress in childhood can just, literally shift your body. And it can be really frightening. And at the same time, it can be really awakening.
Very frightening indeed, especially for those who are in those developmental stages early on. Really critical periods where they're encountering and trying to make sense of everything. Then you throw on top of that all the intergenerational trauma, the racial oppression, things like that. So certainly a very complex topic. Before we go, I want to read a couple of the comments from the YouTube audience, and really you guys are participants as well. So Adrian Burton says, yes, when you see me, I'm not just responding to this one racial slight, but hundreds of years of abuse stored in my cellular memory. And he certainly speaks to that the cortisol buildup and for ourselves, but really it's intergenerational. And Hilary Gustav says a sentiment I think that everybody shares, which is that she just said, learning so much from everyone here. Thank you. And in a later comment, she continues by posing the question, can anyone recommend their favorite personal YouTube video and or online guided exercise to help soothe and relax stress and emotions? So I just want to make you aware that you can continue to comment even after we close the broadcast today. We want this to be an ongoing dialogue. This is very refreshing, and it's only the first episode of our book club for this particular book, and certainly our first one for the entire year. So I'm going to hand it back to Emma at this point where she will close us out. Emma?
Thank you so much, Ronnie, and thank you so much to our incredible panelists. My gosh, this discussion has been amazing. And thank you to our audience over in YouTube. Your commentary and your contributions have added so much to this discussion, and we're so grateful that you've joined us today. So this brings us to a close for this discussion today. Again, thank you all for being here and being a part of the TRF community. And we hope that you'll join us for the remaining sessions. Like Ronnie said, this is only the first, as we continue to discuss The Body Keeps the Score. We will meet next week, March 2nd at 4 p.m. Eastern Time for our second episode to discuss part 2 of the book, This Is Your Brain on Trauma, chapters 4 through 6. Everyone registered for book club will receive an email with next week's YouTube link, and you can also find that information when you log in to your TRF members account. If you're interested in applying to be a panelist, please fill out the questionnaire that has been dropped into the chat today. You will also find this in your next book club email and in your TRF members account. Participation in the panel enrolls you to be selected for the final panel with Dr. Bessel van der Kolk on March 30th. So before we go, I'd like to share information about 3 exciting upcoming events at the Foundation. So first, for the 34th year, Dr. Bessel van der Kolk and TRF will host the annual Boston International Trauma Conference, bringing together some of the world's most innovative leaders from the field of trauma, attachment, neuroscience, mindfulness, body-oriented work, and psychedelic studies. This live, virtual, and in-person event will take place May 17th through 20th, 2023. Tickets are on sale now with special early bird prices available until April 19th, and we encourage you to register today. Next up, the Traumatic Stress Studies Certificate Program that Ronnie mentioned during this discussion will launch its next cohort on Monday, February 27th, really soon. So exciting. Our intensive postgraduate level certificate program consists of 32 weeks of immersion into the fundamental issues necessary to become an expert clinician treating adults and children who suffer from traumatic stress. This is a self-paced online course with monthly live virtual Q&As with the experts in the field of trauma. Lastly, our Trauma-Informed Neurofeedback Certificate Program will launch its spring cohort on March 20th. The Trauma Research Foundation recognizes neurofeedback as one of the tools that can help to rewire a physiological system that has become dysregulated as a result of trauma. We invite licensed mental health or medical professionals to explore this high-level comprehensive certification. Please check out our website to learn more about these events. And thank you again to our panelists, new and returning. Thank you to our incredible moderators, Atra Tarfa and Ronnie Ang. And thank you to the TRF team who are all making this book club happen. We'd love to hear from your experience. Feel free to reach out and share any feedback with us. Thank you again, Atra and Ronnie, for guiding us through today's session. And we hope to see all of you here again next week. Thank you.